The sky above the Pacific turned crimson as the sun descended toward the horizon. 23 years old, Lieutenant Yukio Seki gazed at the photograph of his young wife one final time before tucking it into his breast pocket, directly above his heart, where it would be incinerated with the rest of him moments after impact. He pulled his white headband tight, the characters for "Certain Victory" stretching across his forehead. The aircraft's engine roared to life, a mechanical death rattle. His aircraft, now nothing more than a guided missile with human eyes, would never land again. Like hundreds of pilots before and after him, Seki had become what Americans would call Kamikaze, the divine wind that Japan believed would sweep invaders from their sacred shores. This was not battle. This was ritual sacrifice performed with aluminum and aviation fuel. The term kamikaze, divine wind, references the typhoons that twice destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century, seemingly sent by the gods to protect Japan. By late 1944, as American forces pushed ever closer to the Japanese homeland, military leaders resurrected this ancient spiritual protection in human form. Young men would become the storm, the divine wind, crashing explosive-laden aircraft directly into Allied ships in a final act of devotion to emperor and nation. What makes the kamikaze phenomenon so difficult for Western minds to comprehend, explains historian Emiko Onuki-Tierney, is that it existed at the intersection of modern warfare technology and ancient concepts of ritual death. These weren't simply suicide missions, they were acts of transcendence, transforming pilots into human gods through self-sacrifice. The Special Attack Units, as they were officially known, emerged from desperation. Japan's conventional air forces had been decimated, experienced pilots increasingly rare. Aircraft production couldn't match American manufacturing might. Fuel reserves dwindled. Traditional combat tactics yielded diminishing returns against overwhelming Allied naval power. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, conceived a solution of terrible elegance. If Japan could not outproduce America, perhaps it could break American resolve through displays of sacrifice so shocking that the enemy would lose heart. On October 19, 1944, Onishi addressed a room of young pilots at Mabalacat Airfield. "Japan is in grave danger," he told them. "The salvation of our country is now beyond the powers of the ministers of state, the general staff, and lowly commanders like myself. It can come only from spirited young men such as you. Thus, on behalf of your 100 million countrymen, I ask of you this sacrifice." The first unit, dubbed Shimpu, consisted of 26 volunteers. The very next day, the first kamikaze attacks struck American vessels in Leyte Gulf. 5 aircraft, each loaded with a 550-pound bomb, dove toward their targets. One struck the Australian heavy cruiser HMAS Australia, killing 30 sailors and wounding 64. Another hit the deck of the escort carrier USS St. Louis, igniting aviation fuel and bombs, sinking the vessel with 143 American sailors dead. A terrible new phase of the Pacific War had begun. The most disturbing aspect of the kamikaze program wasn't the tactics themselves, but the calculated psychology behind them. These weren't impulsive suicide charges born of battlefield fervor. They represented industrial-scale production of ritual death. Training facilities were established, tactics refined, special ceremonies developed, psychological conditioning perfected. Imperial Japan's greatest triumph was convincing these young men, most university-educated and from the nation's elite families, that their highest purpose was to die spectacularly, notes historian Mako Sasaki. The system transformed intellectual young men into weapons through spiritual and nationalist indoctrination that began in childhood and culminated in death letters written to parents thanking them for the honor of sacrificing their lives. Contrary to popular Western imagination, many kamikaze pilots weren't fanatical volunteers. Pressure to volunteer was immense. Those who hesitated faced ostracism, shame, and questions about their loyalty. Some squadron leaders simply volunteered entire units without individual consent. Pilots who openly refused might be beaten by comrades or reassigned to suicidal ground combat. The veneer of willing sacrifice covered a complex reality of social coercion, psychological manipulation, and genuine patriotism twisted to fatal ends. The training itself was paradoxical, learning to fly only to die. Pilots received just enough instruction to navigate to targets and execute an accurate diving attack. Fuel was allocated for one-way journeys only. Aircraft were stripped of safety equipment, radios, and even guns to make room for larger explosive payloads. The cockpit became both throne and coffin. At Chiran Air Base on Kyushu's southern tip, the launching point for many kamikaze missions against Okinawa, pilots prepared for death through purification rituals. They bathed, clipped fingernails and hair to be sent home to families for burial, and participated in ceremonies that transformed them from men into living spirits. Many drank sake from ceremonial cups, taking symbolic communion with ancestors who had died for Japan throughout its history. The night before missions, pilots often wrote final letters home. These documents, now preserved in Japanese museums, reveal the complex humanity behind mythologized sacrifice. 23-year-old Toshio Anazawa wrote to his mother, "I am pleased to have the honor of having been chosen as a shield for His Majesty, and I shall be a glorious guardian of our nation. I shall fall like beautiful cherry petals for the Emperor." Yet in the same letter, this young man who would never grow old admitted, "I cannot help crying when I think of you, father and mother." Corporal Takamasa Senda left behind words that haunt, "When autumn comes and the leaves turn red in our garden, please gather some for me, mother." Such poignant humanity complicates simplified narratives of fanaticism. The aircraft themselves embodied the desperate state of Japan's war effort. While early attacks used modified Zero fighters, later raids featured purpose-built suicide craft. The Oka rocket-powered human missile carried over 2,600 pounds of explosives. The Kaiten was essentially a manned torpedo. Some pilots flew obsolete training planes hardly capable of reaching their targets. By war's end, experimental wooden aircraft were being constructed for kamikaze missions, to be piloted by teenagers with minimal training. The technological regression we observe in kamikaze aircraft reflects Japan's collapsing industrial capacity, observes military historian Richard Frank. They began with sophisticated warplanes and ended with what amounted to flying coffins constructed from piano crates and leftover wood. This wasn't just military desperation, it represented the complete inversion of modern warfare ethics, where human lives became expendable while machinery grew precious. Their targets were primarily Allied vessels supporting the island-hopping campaign toward Japan. Aircraft carriers were the most coveted targets, though any ship would suffice. Pilots were instructed to aim for the bridge or elevator platforms where their explosives would cause maximum damage. The attack profile was simple but effective. Approach at high altitude beyond anti-aircraft range, identify the target, then execute a steep diving attack while evading defensive fire. Americans developed countermeasures, combat air patrols, concentrated anti-aircraft fire, and strategic zigzagging. But nothing could stop all attackers. Even after being hit by defensive fire, damaged kamikaze planes often remained deadly, careening into ships as burning projectiles. A pilot determined to die could absorb damage that would force conventional attackers to withdraw. At sea, off Okinawa in spring 1945, the Kikusui operations launched wave after wave of kamikazes against the American fleet. On April 6th alone, 355 aircraft struck, damaging or sinking dozens of vessels. The destroyer USS Bennett took a direct hit that killed 28 sailors. The ammunition ship USS Hobbs Victory exploded catastrophically, killing all 306 men aboard. In total, kamikaze attacks sank 47 Allied ships and damaged hundreds more, killing nearly 5,000 sailors. Seaman Bob Feller, who would later become a Baseball Hall of Famer, recalled watching kamikazes attack his ship. You'd see these planes coming in, and you knew the pilot was already dead in his mind. Something happens to you when you watch a man deliberately fly into death. It wasn't like regular combat. It was like watching someone from another world. The psychological impact on American forces proved significant. One naval officer wrote home, "The Japanese have discovered a perfect terror weapon. There's something unnatural about fighting an enemy who wants to die." Within Japan's military hierarchy, the program generated internal conflict. Some officers opposed the tactic as wasteful of trained pilots and contrary to Bushido tradition. Admiral Onishi himself reportedly said privately, "If we are to die, let us die defending the homeland against the enemy's landing forces, not out at sea where our deaths will serve no strategic purpose." Perhaps most tragically misunderstood is what historian Emiko Onuki-Tierney calls the cherry blossom paradox. Many kamikaze pilots were intellectuals, university students studying literature, philosophy, and Western thought. Their diaries reveal men who had read Shakespeare, Goethe, and Dostoevsky in the hours before their deaths. Some privately questioned the war while publicly embracing their sacrifice. They were not simple fanatics, but complex human beings caught in what one pilot called the strangling tentacles of war and nationalist fervor. The diary of Hayashi Ichizo, found after his death, reveals this complexity. "I am not going out for the emperor or for the empire. I am going for my beloved wife, who departed this life last year, and for my mother, who has been a widow for 14 years. I want to see them again in the Pure Land." By war's end, approximately 3,800 kamikaze pilots had died. Their average age was just 19. For all their sacrifice, they failed to change the war's outcome. Vice Admiral Onishi, the program's architect, committed ritual suicide after Japan's surrender, writing in his final note, "I alone bear complete responsibility for the failure of the Kamikaze Special Attack Force. The only way I can apologize is to commit suicide." In present-day Japan, the kamikaze legacy remains controversial. At Chiran Peace Museum, where belongings of dead pilots are displayed alongside their final letters, elderly visitors sometimes leave offerings. Younger generations often view the kamikaze program as evidence of militarism's dangers. Both perspectives contain truth. Today, 7 decades later, underwater archaeologists have discovered the broken remains of kamikaze aircraft on the Pacific seabed. Twisted propellers, shattered engines, occasional human remains. These silent artifacts rest where coral now grows through aluminum skin, where fish dart through cockpits once occupied by young men clutching photographs of loved ones they would never see again.